So how many times have you seen some guy stand in front of you, pull this out of his pocket, and start riffing on the wonders of technology? This is great science. I don't understand it. My 11-year-old daughter has to program it so I can go online and see what's up. You've heard that speech how many times? Not today. Because science is great, the frontiers of knowledge have been pushed back so that we can enjoy lots of pretty amazing new stuff. But this is not a story of technology. This is a story of economics and how we unleash technology to put a whole new world in our pocket. And I hope when you walk out of here in a few minutes that you understand this in a way, and you understand your world, information and everything else, in a way that you might not have exactly seen it before. Now, there is a little bit of science to this, and so we'll just start with that. It's kind of like magic. Einstein's reputed to have said, "The telegraph is like a long cat. You pull its tail in Los Angeles and it meows in New York. Wireless is like the same, but there is no cat. And it seems like a trick." By the way, Einstein didn't say that, but he's quoted everywhere as having said a lot of things he didn't say. So it really does seem mystical, and maybe not to this audience. Maybe you just grew up with wireless as a kind of a background amenity. But in 1895, this man, who, by the way, was British and Italian, Guglielmo Marconi, he actually invented a radio, a way to send signals and communications and the interpretation all done by electronics so that we could use this great invisible resource that we now call radio spectrum. The economics are profound. The original policy in the United States, which is what we're going to focus on, but it's this way everywhere, was that there was an endemic market failure. It was too complicated for markets, decentralized decision makers, entrepreneurs, consumers, investors. It was too complex. It had to be organized by a central administrative authority, the state. And so this market failure idea was out there. And in fact, it did seem a little bit tricky. I mean, there are lots of technologies, and they all ran into each other. In wireless space, it's hard to see the boundaries. And so even the United States Supreme Court talked about the endemic market failure, which they called a cacophony of competing voices. That's a quote from our United States Supreme Court describing the rationale for why the government had to be in charge of radio spectrum. By the way, for you excellent spellers, you'll notice cacophony is misspelled. That's the way the Supreme Court did it, and I always leave the misspelling in. You have these transmissions in radio space, and radios are supposed to receive what's transmitted, but if you have too many of them, and there's a lack of coordination, there is a problem. Is that a market failure? Indeed, it was called such by government analysts, including I like the fresh term, etheric bedlam. Use that sometimes when there's a little bit of chaos at your house. It was a problem triggered by innovation. In fact, in the first 25 years after Marconi's great invention, there was not a problem in radio space. There was no conflict over property rights, who got what radio. Why? There weren't that many radios. But finally, there was economic progress. And this is one thing to remember. Economic progress forces policy challenge. There are always going to be people who say, well, it's not perfect. You know, there are a lot of problems with what we're doing with technology. Duh. Every time you get the advance, you force new questions and new determinations. And so, with a great innovation in 1920 called broadcasting, a new form of sending signals, high-powered signals in all directions, usually from a high point, to lots of receivers, one-way transmissions. By the way, broadcasting is an actual agricultural term. Did not come from the electronics world. It means you cast your seeds widely. You don't plant one at a time. And so this new mass market service takes off in the United States just by chance, just by economic innovation, by a company called, KDKA was the station in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, owned by Westinghouse, a company that wanted to sell radios. And think about that one. Who would build the first transmitter? There are no radio receivers. On the other hand, who would buy the first radio receiver when there are no transmitters? This is a case for vertical integration, and that's what happened. But when Westinghouse built the first transmitter, boom, within 2 years, 500 radio stations. Seemed like such a powerful way to communicate with a mass market, and everybody's doing it, not just radio sellers. And what happens in the United States is very British. We actually had a law in the books that gave a cabinet official, the Secretary of Commerce, who was a very famous man, later became president, Herbert Hoover, an actual engineer, an actual brilliant engineer who understood radio technology in a very subtle way and understood his powers as Secretary of Commerce to establish first come, first serve, what's called in common law, priority and use rules. If you develop and start establishing the use of a resource for productive purpose, helping the public receive some new radio or any other service, you established an ownership right. And in fact, the US government backed up these rights for 6 years. And there was no chaos, there was no cacophony, despite the folklore that would come later, and this folklore would go to every country in the world. Every regime is founded on the idea of endemic market failure. In fact, for 6 years, there was orderly development in the United States. And it was just the simple first come, first serve assignment. Don't believe me, I can give you the numbers on how many millions of radio households were investing in radio receiver sets. Obviously, there's no etheric bedlam, there's no market failure. These were, by the way, about $2,000 in today's units, big consoles, millions of households investing. But I'll give you the Art Deco instead. I love these magazine covers from 1925. It's already moved to romance. Get a radio, impressor. But this one I like better because it's so contemporary. This was 1926. They're on the honeymoon, wedding night, alone at last. She's crying, he's fiddling with his radio. And the great thing for gender equity, let's hear it for gender equity. 100 years later, this could be reversed, don't you think? She's fiddling on her phone and ignoring him on the wedding night. So there is progress. So this is a killer app. This is the world of wireless and mass communications coming in a way that was just profound, but there was a political problem. The political problem will sound very familiar to students today in this room of public choice. Commercial radio stations had gotten established, and they knew that new entry by the use of new radio waves, new bandwidth, would threaten their position. It's called competitive entry. There might be a way to stop that with a licensing program that cut things short. And they were in favor, and in fact, in 1925, the National Association of Broadcasters forms and asks for regulation under a public interest standard. At the same time, political leaders, including Hoover at the Department of Commerce, he was later to become president, members of Congress and the Senate, they desperately wanted some control over this this incredibly influential medium of public opinion that was developing. And don't tell me here in England you don't understand this, because you went actually to a government monopoly solution, the BBC. The post office initially takes over all broadcasting to control with government administrative determination of what content can go over the airwaves. And that was the same issue in a different institutional context that rallied the regulation and it sort of spirited this coalition between the incumbent policymakers and the incumbent industry, the commercial broadcasters. And so it all comes together in 1927 after in 1926, the Department of Commerce actually just arbitrarily stops enforcing the first come, first serve rule. How do they do that? They just said, well, we don't have any authority and we're backing off. And then there was some chaos. There hadn't been, there was. It was called the period of the breakdown of the law. And that was on one day, July 9th, 1926, Department of Commerce backs off. And by the expression and the analysis of the day, there had been law, and now it's broken down. And so, in fact, in November of 1926, a very interesting common law case gets decided in Chicago. This is a Chicago headline from November of 1926. Just ignore the standard Chicago headline, which is that some municipal official is going to jail. The The court fixes rights on air, WGN wins, wavelength decision sets U.S. precedent. Aerial property rights defined. Under common law, a judge awarded a given station the right to kick another station off its frequency, another station that during this national chaos where the feds are not enforcing the first come, first serve rules, is actually moving around and finding another slot. And there was conflict, but the law is kicking in. And that's nice. That's actually under British common law, obviously adopted in the colonies. And what happens now is that the coalition says we've got to regulate quick. We don't want these property rights to go out. And in fact, that's what happens immediately. February of 1927, there is finally a Radio Act. Many actors, including Hoover, have been calling for it for years. They wanted political discretion over who got to broadcast and what they said. And that comes with the public interest standard in the Radio Act. This is the New York Times headline from the following day, signed by the President of the United States, Calvin Coolidge. The first sentence of this act preempts private ownership in the airwaves, so no vested interests in channels. Radio spectrum is allocated by a commission. This is why I call it the political spectrum. Radio waves now allocated not by market bids, resources going to the highest value. It's being divvied up and allocated to a radio station or a technology or any particular business model by the regulators under this, the vague public interest standard. And it becomes known, even to the regulators themselves, as a system of mother may I. So here's the point. Instead of having people go into the market and make economic arrangements, buy their access to radio spectrum, they have to ask the government for permission. And this influences everything. And the fact that we've overcome to some degree influences everything else. Let me give you two stories that tell you both sides of this. Here's the first one, a great scientist, a physicist, and one of the preeminent inventors of the 20th century, Edward Howard Armstrong, graduated from Columbia University in 1912, started graduate school. They immediately made him a professor. In the 1920s, he's the largest shareholder in RCA, Radio Corporation of America, just on his patents. He was, well, here he is. He invented the world's first boom box. I don't know if you use that expression over here, portable radio. He's on this is, by the way, his honeymoon in 1923. And he's given his bride a portable radio. So that was pretty good. And he's in a suit on the beach in Florida, so that's even better. But at any rate, he keeps working, and radio takes off, as I've already told you. And 1934, he comes up with a better radio. What's the better radio in 1934? You know it as FM, frequency modulation. And it's high fidelity. It sounds beautiful. It goes farther. And all he needs is mother may I. He goes to the regulators and asks for permission, 1934, and they say, well, first of all, we've checked on this and it doesn't work. Well, who did they check with? All the AM radio stations. And they said FM didn't work. Well, at his own expense, Armstrong builds transmission facilities, does the tests, and he actually is quite persistent, and he's the most famous radio inventor in the United States. By 1937, he does have permission and an allocation on some bands to go to work, and he does, and they sell 400,000 radios by the time World War I breaks out. And by the way, when I speak in Europe, I always love to say when World War II breaks out, I always like to say when World War II breaks out in 1941, as it did in the United States. Sorry, we were a little late to the party. So here's a picture of a 1941 radio, and the bottom you might recognize 550 to 1700 AM dial. You might not recognize what's in the middle, which was called FM. That was 42 to 50. That's what the FCC, the US regulators, said could be used for this new whiz-bang technology. And it was. And they sold 400,000 radios. Again, these are the $2,000 radios. These are huge consoles. They're expensive. And the reviews are fantastic. This is the greatest thing certainly since AM, because it's the great sound quality. But World War II stops all civilian production. What happens in 1945? The regulators, on a request from the television industry, decide to, in 1945, completely eliminate the 1941 allocation. This this expensive radio console you're looking at is obsolete in 1945, and all those hundreds of thousands of customers have worthless hardware in their living rooms, and the industry is destroyed. There is a new allocation made. You know where FM goes. Where does FM go? Don't look. 88 to 108. Okay, that's what we have today. That's what was changed in 1945. Armstrong was apoplectic. He and the FM industry said there's no problem, there's no issues, let's stay where we are. There was a scientific debate that was fraudulent on the part of the regulators. They were pushed by the television industry to move this. At any rate, at the end of the day, Armstrong could not get his technology going because he couldn't sell the new radios to the people who had spent all the money on the obsolete radios. And in 1954, this great inventor, 63 years old, writes a note to his wife, explains his frustration with the Federal Communications Commission, and walks out an 11th floor window on the Upper East Side of New York City. Gone at 63, the greatest radio inventor, really, of the 20th century. That is a tragic metaphor for the graveyard for innovation that's caused by Mother May I. People with great ideas not being able to get them into the marketplace. And by the way, had Armstrong lived to see what happened when FM was finally unleashed in the 1960s with rules that were fair and open, you know what the thing was. By the middle 1970s, FM had almost completely displaced AM because of its superior sound quality, the only thing left on AM being news and sports. All music moved to FM. So that was what happened when the government was in charge. And there's another radio story that I'm going to tell you in just a minute. What happened when things changed, but why did they change? Well, some people started thinking seriously about this problem. The lack of innovation, the lack of competition, the capture by incumbent interests of the whole regulatory system. And one of them was named Ronald Coase, and he was from the UK, but he practiced his craft of economics in the United States, and he started thinking and writing about the BBC and then the Federal Communications Commission, and he just asked the question, why couldn't a market come in here and assign ownership rights to radio frequencies and have competitors in the marketplace decide what service goes what and what technology can fit with other technologies? How can interference be best coordinated? He noticed that zero interference, no conflict between services was not the optimum. If you want to eliminate interference, you're going to eliminate everything. You want the most output. And some of that takes compromise and extra investment in certain pricing systems and all kinds of other forms of coordination. The property rights system that had actually governed the U.S. radio market and its burgeoning success emerging in the 1920s was the futuristic idea of Ronald Coase. But people weren't ready for this idea that competitive markets might work better. In fact, he was asked to go to the United States government and give testimony about his radical proposal in 1959. The first question he got from a commissioner of the FCC, tell us, Professor Coase, is this all a big joke? The punchline, and I'm skipping a few decades here, is that that radical idea won. It was not obvious to anybody that it would go anywhere. But in fact, over the decades and all the way to the current time, we've been moving in the direction of property rights to radio spectrum. And the liberalization that has occurred is the reason you have a cell phone in your pocket. Now, there used to be, in fact, the determination of the United States government on the first round of this was natural monopolies. Cellular has to be in it. By the way, when was the cellular technology actually a technology? When did it become a thing? What day? Give me a guess. I'm not giving out bitcoins. Raise your hand anyway. What's the day? Take a guess. Come on. No penalty for loss. What was it? Who? When? 94? It was earlier. July 28, 1945. the most famous and popular magazine in America, Saturday Evening Post, has an article from the chairman of the Federal Communications Commission talking about his visit to Bell Labs, owned by AT&T, with cellular technology. He said it'd take a couple years to get the licenses out. Cellular opened up 39 years later because it didn't take 2 years. It was held up that long by the regulatory process. So, yeah, the first determination was made, by the way, in 1970, official by the United States government. This had to be a monopoly. In fact, it had to be a monopoly tied to the existing fixed line monopoly. Otherwise, you couldn't have any service. Now, we know that here in the UK, you got 4 head-to-head mobile operators. In the United States, we have 4 a lot of countries have 3. Some countries have 5. It's obviously a case where the markets can open and do amazing things through coordination under a system that has so little central coordination, just basic fundamental property rights, that it's really mind-boggling. So we did cede in the United States, in the UK, and in fact in most countries of the world, most all countries, from Nigeria to Guatemala, we've got property rights to radio spectrum held by private head-to-head competitors in the mobile marketplace. You understand how radical that is? Not just when Coase was talking about wireless, but just go back to 1980. British Telecom, NTT in Japan, France Telecom, all the countries that I've mentioned had state monopoly PTTs, post, telegraph, telephone, all wrapped up in the state sector. And that's all gone in terms of private, competitive spectrum owners giving you this. And this would not be here were we still in the age of the PTT. So we have license auctions, and that's part of this liberalization as well, but it's really the small part of it. The big part is the de facto property, the rights that we've actually authorized, where we now allow market owners to compete and offer you new services. And so I'm going to tell you how this works in one simple story. 2005, there's somebody inventing a new telephone, a new wireless device in Cupertino, California. And you know who that is. I don't even have to put up his picture. And they look around to the world that's already become really interesting for wireless, and not in a way that would make any sense to Edwin Howard Armstrong. The new world was private carriers competing to provide new services, yet they thought that all the phones were really, really poor. And there should be something wonderful and beautiful and elegant and iconic. They needed spectrum for their phone because guess what? The iPhone does nothing if it doesn't have access to radio waves. And by authority in the United States, the UK, everywhere else, the authority takes something like an act of Congress, the 27 Radio Act, and the idea that there are no but now there are implicit or de facto property rights. So how did Apple get spectrum, radio rights for the phone? This is all seamless to you. Markets take care of this in a very transactionally efficient way. You buy the phone, you don't even think about the rights. They had to get the rights. Where did they go? They did not go to Washington, D.C. They did not ask permission. There was no mother may I. Edwin Howard Armstrong had to ask and died trying. Steve Jobs went to the marketplace, and he negotiated first with Verizon in the United States, our largest carrier, then with Sprint, our not largest carrier, then with the second largest carrier, AT&T. Finally, at the end of the day, AT&T made a deal. You can use our spectrum for your iPhone. Who paid who? How much did Apple pay? How much? No, nothing? Guess again, come on. A huge negative number. AT&T gave a major fraction of their equity value to Apple for the privilege of hosting the iPhone. So we didn't even know what way the prices would go. This is what a market does. It surprises you. And that's exactly why we're benefiting. And here's what happened that nobody had the faintest idea of. And you go back to 2003, 2005, and people make fun of the cell phone industry. They had one app They were made fun of because they had one app. They made money on one thing. What was the one app that the phone carriers had in the West? They did better in Japan. We'll talk about iMode if we have time in Q&A. They had one app. It was called a ringtone. But this lay just beyond the horizon as soon as you got another industry involved. And of course, as soon as the iPhone platform comes in, you have a competitor, Google Play. The Android operating system comes in to compete. Roadkill, sorry BlackBerry, sorry Nokia. They were fantastic innovators in their day. They got displaced. And today, you talk about the government trying to figure out where to put an FM band with a few radio stations so as to not to interfere with the other stations. What do you think the complexity of this radio space is? Do you think there's an interference problem here? There's not? I don't know, you think about it. I'll take no or yes as an answer. Depends on your assumptions. Good economics, right? There's an amazing, from the standpoint of what the government's position was on the complexity of radio space has to be done centrally. You just think about it. 6 billion people have these radios. It was said more than indoor plumbing. In the book, I note that more people have cell phones than toothbrushes. We share radio spectrum. Hundreds of millions, billions of us share the same radio spaces. That's not an interference problem. And it's not just that, it's that there are over 1 million apps in the Apple App Store. There are more than 1 million other apps in Google Play. Okay, and every time you download anything, you're using up radio space. You're hogging it. These are these iPhones, are you kidding me? Spectrum hogs. Okay, so your Angry Birds, your heart monitor, your map app, your movies, your books, your other books, your dog tracker, your cat videos, your tweets, all of that is interfering. The person sitting next to you is trying to get access. You're trying to get access. That's the hard problem. And in fact, here's something, again, that nobody could have anticipated, and you don't even think about. These are wireless industries. Without deregulation of radio spectrum to give us the coordination that makes possible simple apps by the millions, we would not have industries founded on the smartphone. So the complexity that goes just by order, and it doesn't seem like there's any problem. You don't have a problem. You don't worry about who's in your neighborhood using your phone, using their phone on your same network. It's seamless because the market system of competition is taking investment capital on one side, technology inputs on the other, and forming business models to coordinate incredible complexity far beyond the interference problem that was ever anticipated in the 1920s as saying that it was too complicated for the market. This was way too complicated for the government. So, yeah, as we look around the world, even 10 years ago, the New York Times, can the cell phone end global poverty? Well, it's helping, yeah. Growth rates go up with cell phone penetration. There is a revolution in progress. And in fact, there's a battle right now to get more bandwidth because the next generation, 5th generation technology, we still have a lot of underbrush to clear. We have a lot of rigidities left over from the good old days of top-down, mother may I, in the US and elsewhere. In some areas, actually, the UK is doing better than the United States. In fact, EU is doing better than the United States in getting new bandwidth out. In other areas, the United States has been very liberal, and we pushed ahead and have become a technology leader as a result of it. There's a reuse of old bandwidth. Stuff allocated for satellites is now being reused or reauthorized, or we have to get past the politics, actually. This is satellite bandwidth in the United States. It's now the licensees are asking for permission to do terrestrial 5G, and that can just pack so much more in, but we've got to have more property rights, a system of liberalism. And so if we want to make progress, we should pay attention to how we got here, what the impediments are today, what barriers we have overcome, and where we can go from here. Coase was thought to be a crank and naive, but in fact we have proof of concept in the strongest terms possible. We have entire new sectors to the economy that would not be here if the government really had to manage it top down. And that's a lesson that I think we might want to take to heart. And here I'll just leave you with Professor Summers. Larry Summers was Secretary of the Treasury in the Obama administration, or was it Clinton? He worked in both Clinton and the Obama administrations, and he's a professor at Harvard. He's a very famous economist, and he made actually a very apt comment just a few years ago. He was giving an interview where he sort of discovered this. When you're at Harvard, you have to discover this the hard way. He looked around a bit. He said, markets are able to do things that people used to think required government coordination. He was kind of surprised by that. He says, markets make it possible to rent videos in every town in America with no public involvement. Well, that's good. He was impressed by video rentals, okay? Video rentals are dead because of your phone, by the way. Because it all comes streaming over this bandwidth that is so efficient. Anyway, it's a few years ago. He's got a historical defense on this when he said it. But you know, Larry ought to buy a cell phone and see how complicated this world is. And when you see how the market has overcome that, how we're overcoming it even now, and yet we still have barriers to get past. More bandwidth is out there that's still allocated, by the way, for the killer app of 1952, over-the-air broadcast television. We still have about half the spectrum that we set aside in 1952 for broadcast television, still set aside for the same application in the United States today. Other countries, don't smile, you're not that much better. So I hope you appreciate the Hayekian spontaneity with this development, the Schumpeterian innovation, the Coasean property rights, how important that liberalization and these market reforms have been, and by the way, by consensus all the way around, and how this economic growth is helping people, particularly in lower income countries around the world, getting access to the internet. People in India have access to the internet today through emerging wireless mobile systems. And by the way, the Indian government is particularly terrible in allocating bandwidth. And as slow as they go, they should go much faster. They have lessons to learn as well. There has been scientific advance, no doubt about it. But it takes market deployment to get the investment, the research, the development, and in fact the proof of concept, just to understand what wireless technologies people will buy, people will use, and society will gain from. So that's in there, and if we hadn't gotten all the benefits in, free speech is pretty important, and some of us think it may be among the most important aspects of these new networks that have developed and are carried with us. But you know, I'm an optimist. I not only think our job is not half done, I don't think we've seen anything in terms of the progress that's coming. So thank you very much.